Right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Olga Jurasz. I'm director of the Center for Protecting Women Online. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this online book launch of Mariana Valente's most recent book, Online Misogyny in Brazil, Law, Internet Governance, and the Struggle for Gender Justice. The book is published with Springer, and very luckily for us readers, it is open access. The format of today's webinar is a conversation with Mariana as the author, with, of course, an opportunity to ask questions at the end. So as you listen to the conversation with Mariana, if any questions come to mind that you would like to put forward, I would ask that you kindly please put them in the Q&A on Teams, and there will be time at the end to make sure that these are also asked. For those of you who had a chance to look at the book and read it, you would know that the book gives us plenty of content and food for thought and topics to explore that are quite timely to discussions that we're having today. But before we start, I would also like to introduce Mariana. So Dr. Mariana Valente is an assistant professor of law at the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland and co-founder of Internet Lab in Brazil. She researches technology-facilitated gender-based violence, and the book that she will be discussing with us today was nominated for the Jabuti Award, which is Brazil's most prestigious literary prize. Mariana has advised major public institutions on AI and deepfakes, including Brazil's Federal Senate and the Presidency's Secretariat of Communication. She's also worked with international institutions such as the United Nations. And in 2025, she received the Internet Governance Highlights Award from CGI Brazil, which is Brazilian Internet Steering Committee. Mariana, it's a pleasure to have you here. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. So thank you very much for taking the time today to talk to us about your book. I've spoken to you about this book several times, so it's even more of my pleasure to bring that conversation to a larger audience. For those who have not had a chance to read your book yet, would you mind just starting off by briefly telling us what your book is about?
Yes, sure. And first, Olga, really thank you for this invitation. It's really a pleasure to be in this community. I think it's also important to say that your book on online misogyny, online as a hate crime, was the first thing I read when I started looking at misogynistic speech specifically. And that was years ago. And I remember really finding that there was so little about this topic online, and how happy I was to find your book at the time. And I really read it in detail, taking notes. I keep till this day. So it's really great to be in this company years later. And second, this speaks to the importance of writing and publishing. So let's go to it. Why the book, right? So my book is a systematic reconstruction of nearly 15 years of both legal and social disputes on gender justice in the digital environment in Brazil. And that's specifically from 2012 to 15. And I've been working in research on that ever since. And it traces this trajectory of a time when online harm was dismissed as occurring, let's say, in a lawless land, to the current state, right? That's very different. It's a state where not only online misogyny became diversified, complex, but the word misogyny itself really started being part of the public debate. And we see the process I treat also through the lenses of what I call juridification in the book. That's where social demands have really been translated into specific laws. We saw in these years that feminist movements, legal institutions, civil society have really mobilized to address online misogyny through a series of, in Brazil, 9 laws. So 9 laws were enacted during this period to tackle this, and most of them are criminal in nature. And then in the book, I explore the tensions, limitations, and contradictions of relying primarily on that, right? Criminal law to combat structural gender inequality online. What I do is specifically analyze how this fight against online misogyny has shaped internet governance debates and legislation as well. And that's from an early focus on non-consensual intimate images. That was the first issue that was really discussed in the Brazilian public sphere regarding TFGBV or online misogyny, to current challenges, right, which are related to gendered political violence, AI generated deepfakes. So this book explores how the internet became a battlefield where on the one side, feminist counterpublics use digital tools for solidarity, resistance, even building that legal discourse, but simultaneously they face a fierce conservative backlash that weaponizes those tools as well.
Thank you. And as you say, I think we've been definitely noticing quite a shift, I think, from where we've been 10 years ago, in terms of legal regulation, in terms of how we think about online misogyny and platform regulation, internet governance more broadly, to where we are today. I'm not sure we've moved far enough towards solutions yet, but the journey itself is, I think, quite worth documenting and commenting on. And as some of the audience perhaps may be aware, this is an updated version of the book that you originally wrote in Portuguese. Why was it really important to you to first update the book, update it now, but also why write it for English-speaking audience?
That's interesting. A good question. So when it was published, it was not so long ago. It was 2023. It really hit a nerve. It became widely discussed in Brazil. I think it came out at a time when this issue of online misogyny was really like being an issue in the public sphere and being recognized more and more as an issue. And I felt it was really crucial to bring this perspective also to an English-speaking audience. First, because I feel like there's very little about Brazil out there, and global discussions are very dominated by global north debates about regulatory alternatives, what to do, like even how to describe the problem. I adapted the book for the English version to contextualize Brazilian political, social facts for an international audience, and I incorporated more comparative literature also to facilitate dialogue. But I think what's important and why it's important to have the discussion why out there is that, of course, Brazil isn't unique in experiencing online misogyny. We're speaking of something that's happening globally, but I think Brazil is analytically very valuable, and this is for a few reasons. One is that the problem has a great visibility in Brazil. It's really widely discussed by the media and in the public sphere, and we've been really able to generate a lot of data on how this has been developing on social media specifically. And then there's also a specific combination, and this is also true of a few other countries in the global south, I think, of a very violent colonial history that has effects until this day, like deep inequalities, not only in gender, but also race, class, and combined with a widespread social media adoption. So just some figures on that. We're talking about 90% of internet penetration and 95% of those users using WhatsApp daily. Brazilians are really like, they spend 3.5 hours on social media every day on average. They're really like a connected bunch. So I think this combination makes it interesting. And there were many things that I was analyzing that I felt were important for cross-learning. So of course, we're talking about underlying dynamics that I think are very similar. So how online misogyny functions as censorship, how it intersects with political extremism, how platforms monetize it, how legal systems struggle to address it. But there are some specific things about how the discussion developed very locally in Brazil. So one thing that I discuss in the book is, for example, how when we approved a law in 2014 that's called Marco Civil, it's known as like the Internet Bill of Rights. By that time, we managed to get a specific platform liability rule for non-consensual intimate images, trying to expedite the removal of NCII from platforms. So there's a general rule, and then there's a specific rule for that makes them liable, let's say, more easily. And I feel like that was an important experiment early on how platforms policies can be informed by gender-related concerns. And I wasn't seeing much of that at the time, right, in the discussion about platform regulation. So this is something that Brazilian civil society really managed to put in the public discussion very early on. I think also we're seeing that there's this regulatory landscape evolving rapidly internationally. So the EU Digital Services Act, debate in the UK about criminalizing misogyny, also platform regulation, of course. And there's a lot of need for sharing knowledge and building solidarity across those contexts, especially at a moment when we see also a rollback of protections, right, for women and LGBTQ people. The last thing is that I did need to update it. So that's interesting because I finished writing the English version in 2025. That was only 2 years later. And a lot had happened already. So that's the difficulty in publishing a book about something that's a moving target like that, right? I had to write, for example, about a very important new Supreme Court ruling that established a duty of care for platforms regarding crimes against women that came out last year. Last year, also, there was a new deepfakes law criminalizing deepfakes, which I also needed to include in the book. And we see that this is something that's happening all the time. So everything that developed from the Grok case, for example, would already be a subject for an updated version of a book.
Absolutely. And I think, unfortunately, we live in the world where you could be pretty much just updating book maybe on a weekly basis, let's not say daily. Thank you for that. And I think you spoke about several issues here that I would like to tease out in my next few questions. So bear with me, please. The first one is I would like to go back to, I think, the core theme of your book, which is online misogyny. And as you say, it's something that has really grown in prominence. It's problematized in different way than perhaps it was 10 years ago or so. But it's also something that is very much a global phenomenon. I was wondering, what is particular that you've observed through your research, through your activism, about online misogyny in the Brazilian context?
Good. There's data about that too. There's some surveys doing comparisons, right, about prevalence of online misogyny and also the effects. And when you look at those studies, the prevalence of online harm in Brazil is statistically comparable to global averages. You don't see usually, there are some studies, especially focusing girls, that show a higher prevalence of the FGBV, online misogyny in Brazil. But the severity and nature of impact are very distinct. So there's one survey, for example, that was run by CG, the think tank, together with Ipsos, that showed that that Brazil was ranking top tier on how online violence affects victims' physical safety, mental health, even the desire to live. So when you look at all those effects, also their freedom to express political views online, those impacts are really felt more severely in Brazil, and the data shows that. There's also research showing that Brazil ranks 7th globally for online sexual harm, specifically. So yeah, in some of the things, in some of the numbers, you can see some differences, but I think that there's also a very important qualitative difference. One of them has to do with intersectional analysis. So in the Brazilian context, online misogyny is very linked with racial hierarchies as well. When you also look at the data, race and ethnicity are the second most frequent reasons cited by victims of online violence. And that really reflects a vulnerability of Black and Indigenous women in the country. And I know many countries also have those different hierarchies present, right? But that's a particular expression of misogyny in Brazil. So we have some projects monitoring social media. For example, I say we because I'm part of a think tank in Brazil, and we do some projects that monitor online misogyny. And you can really see how violence is also qualitatively different when you're looking at Black and Indigenous women in the country. And then we also have our own version of the manosphere that in Portuguese is called machosfera or machosphere. This is how it became translated. And this is a field where we can really see something that is, let's say, global. You'll see the machosfera, the Brazilian machosfera, really reflecting some of the divisions that exist in the manosphere in the US specifically, but also there's documented research in the UK about that as well. But you can see really specific characteristics. One of them is how some Latin American authors are very influential in the local manosphere. So one person that's very influential, for example, is Olavo de Carvalho. He is a thinker, philosopher that was really a guru of the extreme right. And that leads me to the second point, that's this connection with political extreme politics that are very local as well. We also see extreme effects, which sometimes when I observe research in other countries is not always present. So we have several cases of women who went into exile or gave up running for office because of online misogyny, or people who have to really have security all the time, feminists who have to have security all the time because of how they're being really targeted by this kind of violence. And then I think one last thing that's very particular is connection to political violence. And that I think you can see in other places as well, but it's really strong in Brazil. And then I think it really has to do also with the recent history of politics, and we can explore that, I guess, a little bit.
Thank you. That we'll definitely come back to that. I wanted to jump back to the point you made about the connection between misogyny and extremism and the far right, which you also explore in your book. I was wondering, what are your thoughts on this particular dynamic and how that then relates to platform regulation and tech regulation?
Interesting, yeah. So there's a very profound connection. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Brazilians' recent history, from 2019 to 23, Brazil was governed by President Jair Bolsonaro, and he was a president from the far right who was very known in the past already for misogynistic tropes, aggression. He once told, he was a parliamentarian, he told another female parliamentarian that she didn't deserve to be raped because she was too ugly. And this was something he said live, like in the middle of a political discussion. But that's just a tiny example of the many misogynistic things that and ideas that he was actually putting out. But his election was, of course, not an isolated event, right? He rose from this articulation of far-right movements that was happening over decades. Political scientists in Brazil really reflect on how this relates to the resentments about re-democratization. So Brazil was a military dictatorship in the 60s, 70s, early 80s. And after more than 20 years of military dictatorship, there was a very poorly digested transition. State crimes were not investigated, they weren't punished. So there was this breeding of like resentment after Brazil was democratized again. We had like a citizen constitution and all of that. And he comes out of like this larger movement, right? He's not an isolated person, of course. And what we observed during his campaign and then for the 4 years when he was in power was that this high profile political discourse really acted as a vector for normalizing hostility against women. We would see things that he would say in the media being later reproduced in social media, like really massively. Or on political debates, for example, the same expressions would be used and reused again. Many things that once deemed unspeakable, let's say, began to be heard in the media, on the streets, and that was really observable. And more specifically, we also saw that the manosphere, this machosphere that I was speaking about, started to act as a gateway drug, let's say, to far-right radicalization. And then I explore a lot of Brazilian research showing close ties between this masculinism and extreme right, and a very strong affinity with other radical ideas like neo-Nazism, this ideal of masculinity intertwined with racial purity. So you really see those things intertwined in the communities that bring out this idea, and this also feeding into political radicalization. So this is not unique to Brazil. We can see it globally, of course, but then you see these local characteristics as well. And then you asked me about the role of platforms, or the role of regulation, right? So we're seeing this developing online. We're seeing that this is not just developing online because people are meeting each other, but one thing that started to be observed is how algorithmic recommendation has a role, right? And how content moderation is also, let's say, a weapon in a way, but also not deployed in a way to control this. Many times we can speak more about this, but also because of the kind of attention that this kind of content gets and how business models on these platforms work, right? So what I would say regarding that and the need for regulation is that we really need to move beyond the idea of removing illegal or individual pieces of content, right? There's really a need for regulation to address what we call systemic risks, safety by design, looking into these structures that are helping amplify these kind of discourses that used to be isolated, let's say, and very marginal, and start to become mainstream.
Absolutely. And I think, there are many areas here that I think laws and regulations are really lagging behind on. And I think one of the aspects, I think, of the problem of online misogyny that you also touch upon in your book, and I think it's worth highlighting, is the question of monetization of misogyny. Yeah. It's not only harmful, but highly profitable business. And I was wondering, in this context, what are your thoughts on this? Do you think law regulation has a role to play here when it comes to regulating, addressing the monetization aspect of online misogyny?
Good. No, let me just flesh this out a little bit. There was a study that came out in 2024 by the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, where they look at the manosphere, on the Brazilian manosphere on YouTube, and it's quite shocking because they map the misogynistic channels. They're like criteria for defining what a misogynistic channel is. They have to be primarily producing videos that have masculinist views and things like that. And they found that 80% of these channels were being monetized. And that was either through native tools like revenue ad sharing with YouTube, or selling courses, products, asking for crowdfunding. There were different strategies that were being used. And the number of channels was also rising over the years. It was very clear that there was this pattern. So we can really see a feedback loop there, right? Because monetization transforms misogyny into an industrialized system. So it's not just about individual expressions of prejudice, and content creators, they find this out. They discover that this generates engagement because outrage is engaging, and that generates revenue, and platforms take their cut out of this revenue as well, right? So the incentives are in place for keeping that content online and even leaving it as it is, right? And there's a critical role to be played by regulation there. And I think we don't speak about this enough. We speak a lot about content moderation, but we don't speak about monetization enough, right? So first, we would need transparency rules. It's really hard to know how monetization flows to these actors. And then there should be a strict prohibition of profiting from content that promotes gender-based violence, right? That should be also a rule, in my opinion. And I think if the business model rewards misogyny, that creates incentives for creators to continue producing it, right? And you need to cut it. It's very clear that there shouldn't be profit happening from this content, which in large part is even illegal.
Absolutely, and I think you very nicely kind of led me to my next question, because one of the areas that us as lawyers, but not only lawyers, we can't take all the blame, are talking about, and a lot, I think disproportionately a lot, is the issue of criminalization. And using criminal law as a almost default response or regulatory response to technology facilitated violence against women. And towards the end of your book, you pose a question as to whether misogyny in general should be criminalized. And this is a question that has been explored, I'm sure, not only in Brazilian context, but for example, also asked here in the UK and further afield. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on whether criminal law is a solution to the issue as far as you're concerned, or should we really flip the script a little, and should we be thinking about regulation in broader terms when it comes to really tackling online misogyny through law?
Good. That's one of the hardest questions I can get, I think, and that's because it involves tension within feminism itself, I think. It's not just a tension inside, let's say, my research and my work. I'll be clear about my positions from the beginning. I favor this middle ground. I think that there's a role for criminalization, but I think that prioritizing criminalization really drives us away from things that we should be discussing, and definitely shouldn't be our primary focus. That's what I would say. There is an ongoing discussion in Brazil, and I know in many parts of the world, about criminalizing misogynistic speech per se, right? I think when we're speaking about online misogyny, that's a definitional issue. We're speaking of broader acts, and then there's the issue of misogynistic speech, which in most parts of the world isn't criminalized as hate speech, right? Which is an interesting question to ask ourselves, like why is hate speech criminalized for so many categories, but not for misogynistic speech? And I think that's an important question. And I see a role of criminalization if it's well crafted. There are all the discussions that we have to ask ourselves as legal scholars, of course, of like, how do you craft a crime, right, of misogynistic speech? How do you think of intent and all of those things? But I think one of the things that I do in the book is to be in dialogue with local feminist traditions, and especially Black feminist traditions in Brazil. They're very critical of the use of criminal law for solving social problems. And that's because of how criminal law is very selective. The penal system in general is very selective and really reproduces racial injustices, which I said in the beginning, they really structure Brazilian society. And I know that's the case also in other places, right? So what Black feminists have been saying is Brazil is like, there's only a select part of the population that really goes to jail in the country, and also criminal law doesn't equally protect all women. So there's a lot of research showing, for example, that when it comes to domestic violence, white women are more protected by domestic violence laws than because of how the system works generally, right? So what they're saying is this shouldn't be our answer to social problems because it creates other problems. And if we're thinking from an intersectional perspective, that becomes an issue, right? And I think that's a very important point. first as a broader discussion to reform the system, of course, but also to decenter this a little bit. So I analyzed 9 laws in the book, and 8 out of these 9 rely either solely or predominantly on criminal law. And we're seeing misogyny rising, actually, right? So of course, there's no causal direct relation there. There are other things happening for this misogyny to rise. But what I'm saying is, of course, and I think everybody knows that even when we defend criminalizing something, you don't criminalize something and then you solve it, right? There's so many other aspects that need to be looked at. But I think there's this tendency of us thinking of a problem and then thinking, okay, you create a criminal offense and then that's solved, right? And this is how it's usually resolved in the public debate. No, we have an offense for that in the criminal code. So now there's nothing more the law can do. And I think there's so much more that the law can do. So first, we're talking about online misogyny, and we really should be centering platform regulation, AI regulation. There's so many things that can be done to, for example, tackle this problem of monetization, but also amplification, even the creation of certain kinds of contents. We're discussing AI deepfakes now, for example. There's so much that can be done, and there's so many stakeholders involved, right, beyond the perpetrator. We also don't think much of victim-centered solutions, right? So policies that are really integrated to help survivors, victims of these kinds of violence. We don't think enough of prevention. So there are many, let's say, gender transformative remedies that we could be thinking of, and we're usually taking them for granted when we just focus on criminalization. So that would be my stance. I don't think we can, in this world, how it functions, not rely on criminal law. I think that's also important, on a symbolic level, also to solve some issues, right? Like repeated cases, repeated offenders, and everything. But it shouldn't be so much of our focus as it clearly is.
Absolutely, and I think you touched on a point that that is very common there in terms of perception that once we have an offense, the problem is sorted out. Whereas I think various structural issues, systematic issues still remain in place and are a huge obstacle, no matter how perfect the law is. Your book ends very beautifully, with a powerful statement that as women we cannot give up the internet, and it's a statement that I wholeheartedly agree with. But with the current geopolitical position, with the rise of violence against women, particularly its normalization, online misogyny, all of that makes it quite difficult to really imagine a future where women's digital rights, women's online safety are actually prioritized truly and addressed, not in a kind of performative way that we see, or kind of, well, let's pass one law and tick it off our to-do list manner. Just as a kind of close to our conversation, I was wondering, what is one change that you would like to see when it comes to women's digital rights, to their online safety? And what role do you see for law in that process, in making that one change happen?
Good, yeah. So that thing about women that we shouldn't give up the internet, we can't give up the internet. It's a very timely question, because when we started discussing ROC this year, and we have discussed this together already, Olga, this is one of the arguments that started to be disseminated, right? Well, maybe we shouldn't be posting pictures online because we're making ourselves vulnerable to deepfakes. And this is pretty much asking us to give up the internet, right? I mean, I'm not saying that there aren't critical questions about how our image is being made accessible to private social networks that are using it in different ways. There is a political question there, I know. But just advising women to, let's say, avoid the public spaces of the internet doesn't seem to be exactly my view of a feminist internet either. So yes, this was pretty much, I was pretty much in dialogue with authors like Patricia Williams, for example, from Critical Legal Studies, Critical Racial Studies. She has this powerful paper in which she says that Black women can't give up the law, even if the law was used so long for oppression, because when we're speaking of rights, this is just something that is needed for us to have a status of a body and a social being in a social order, right? And I see it as the same discussion, like we need to have our space online. And this is what we're talking about, right? We're talking about participation broadly and how misogyny hinders that kind of participation. Um, One thing I'd like to see then, I think, coming out of this discussion is a shift from placing a burden on the victim to place a burden on the ecosystem, right? Um, Now we have systems where women must report, block, hide to stay safe. And I really want to see a legal environment where platforms have a proactive duty to prevent gendered violence through also design choices, right? Um, Regulation has a role there in ensuring that the digital space is a space where women can participate fully as citizens, and that's a democratic need, right? That's not a niche issue. We can't be there with fear of being silenced by industrialized hate. Let's say. And then when it comes to the law, one thing that I have seen repeatedly over the years looking at this is that very frequently discussions of tech regulation, either platform or AI regulation, they start out of problems that are very related to gender inequality. So NCAI, for example, or gender-based political violence. And then as the discussion evolves, it turns into something else, and gender kind of loses its centrality, right? So one thing that I've been really thinking about is what gender-sensitive tech regulation looks like and how to make it really a priority in every debate, right? And not just a side issue, which I think is how it's frequently dealt with, right? So we've seen, I think many of us have examples of that. We have a discussion starting, and then suddenly we have a law to protect children, super important, of course, but then the specific gender issue just disappears, right? Or we have transparency rules, but then the part on disclosing gendered aspects of content moderation, let's say either of aggressors, of people or people who report, or the categories, they're just voluntary, right? The platforms don't need to disclose this. That's the case in the DSA, for example, right? So that's what I would really like to see changed, that this is not sidelined, that this is really becomes central in the discussion of tech regulation.
Thank you. I think I'm going to stop here, and I think let's the audience ask any questions. I don't see any just now, but I also wanted to thank you for this conversation today, which I thoroughly enjoyed, as every conversation with you really, but also for all your work and your activism over the years in that space. I think both back in Brazil and over here, it's really great to see this work. I wish there will be a future where we don't need to write books about the rise of online misogyny.
Yeah.
But I think there is still plenty of work to be done to get us there. So thank you for contributing to that, both for your work and your activism. I hope that you enjoyed this conversation with Mariana. You can access her book. It's open access on Springer website, and download it there. The recording of this webinar will be also posted on our YouTube channel, and you can catch up with us there. Also, you can access our website, cpwo.open.ac.uk, where you can see recordings of our past events and also find out about upcoming ones. Mariana, thank you so much for your time today. It was a true pleasure to have this conversation with you.
Thank you, Olga. It's really, really a pleasure always to discuss with you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.